18-month results for GATHER1 look promising, but another pivotal study is still in the works. What else needs to happen for Zimura to become the first FDA-approved therapy for geographic atrophy?
I'm Rebecca Hepp, that's Scott Criswanos, and this is New Retina Radio from Retina Today and Bryn Mawr Communications. New Retina Radio spoke with Dr. Veeral Sheth about what he shared regarding the GATHER1 study at this year's ARVO meeting.
We also spoke with Dr. Matthew Starr about his research on the development of CME following rhegmatogenous retinal detachment surgery. Could his findings help surgeons better understand the risk factors for complications after surgery? Stay tuned for both interviews.
The dry AMD treatment pipeline is packed, and some drugs are closer to completing their pivotal trials than others.
One of those drugs is avacincaptad pegol, or Zimura, which we'll be calling it going forward because that molecule is a mouthful.
Zimura was evaluated in GATHER1, which is a phase 2b/3 study. At this year's ARVO meeting, Dr. Veeral Sheth reviewed the structure and results of GATHER1 and is here to tell us about them.
Dr. Sheth is a partner and the director of clinical trials at University Retina in Chicago. Dr. Sheth, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Zimura addresses the complement pathway at C5, which is further downstream in the complement cascade than some of the other drug candidates in the pipeline. What are the advantages to targeting C5?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's important to note that C5 is the most terminal part of the complement pathway. And so inhibiting at that level allows for the preservation of the majority of the complement pathway, right? We know that the complement pathway itself has value and important features to it. And so we don't want to block the entire pathway. So blocking it at C5 blocks it late enough to have the effect that we want without having potential downside effects.
Let's take a look at GATHER1. What do our listeners need to know about the study design?
Yeah, as you mentioned, GATHER1 is a phase 2b/3 study that we tested Zimura versus sham to reduce the rate of growth of geographic atrophy. There were 3 different doses that we used: Zimura 1 milligram, 2 milligram, and 4 milligram, all versus the sham. And the primary endpoint that we looked at was the change in geographic atrophy from baseline to month 12. And most importantly, the study was designed in line with the FDA guidance on registration studies, including the pre-specified statistical plan.
What was your reasoning for using square root transformation of GA lesion area from baseline?
Yeah, that's a good question. And there's a lot of good papers on this, especially from natural history studies of GA, where we know that a number of factors can impact the growth rate of geographic atrophy, including baseline size, location, for example, if it's an extrafoveal lesion versus a foveal lesion. So using square root transformation negates the impact of these factors on the growth rate.
Can you tell us what you found at 18 months?
Yeah, what we saw at 18 months was pretty exciting because it was in line with what we saw at 12 months, but even more so. And what I mean by that is, as we went on in the study, we saw that gap between Zimura and the sham-treated group increased. So in the 2 milligram Zimura group, we saw that the square root GA lesion area was 28% less than the sham group. And in the 4 milligram group, we saw that there was a 30% less difference than the sham group. And so that's pretty amazing.
Have you seen any toleration issues that you need to worry about?
Good question. The drug was generally well tolerated at 18 months. There were no drug-related SAEs, inflammation, or endophthalmitis. The new onset CNV was observed at a higher rate in the Zimura groups than the sham group.
That's all encouraging news. What's next for Zimura?
Right now, there's a confirmatory GATHER2 study, which is enrolling patients, which is a phase 3 study. That's going to look at 2 milligrams versus the sham group. It's enrolling now, and that enrollment will likely close in the third quarter of this year.
Dr. Sheth, thanks for filling in our listeners and educating your peers.
Thanks to you both.
Ophthalmologists are experienced in observing cystoid macular edema after cataract surgery, which is sometimes linked with risk factors such as epiretinal membrane, history of retinal detachment, and diabetic retinopathy.
But the presence of CME after surgery for rhegmatogenous retinal detachment is not as well understood. Hoping to contribute to our understanding of this phenomenon is research recently presented at ARVO by Dr. Matt Starr.
Dr. Starr is finishing his second year as a retina fellow at Wills Eye Hospital in Philadelphia, and he will be joining the faculty at Mayo Clinic in July. Dr. Starr, thanks for coming on the show and sharing your research.
Oh, thanks, Scott and Rebecca. I really appreciate BMC and Retina Today for allowing me to kind of talk with you all here about this really nice study we did here at Wills.
Let's start at the top. Do we fully understand the etiology of CME after rhegmatogenous retinal detachment surgery?
Not entirely. There's a couple etiologies. Some people or some studies and researchers have proposed that direct damage, cell apoptosis, iatrogenic damage during surgery. But the leading hypothesis is post-surgical inflammation just from having the surgery itself leads to some vasodilatation and vascular leakage leading to cystoid macular edema. And this isn't really well reported in modern vitreoretinal surgery. A lot of studies are from the 1980s, 1990s, and we wanted to see if there's any new risk factors or what is the prevalence in the era of modern day surgery.
All right, why don't you explain the study to us?
This study was a subset study of the PRO database, something that Dr. Ed Ryan in Minnesota put together with six centers across the country, the primary retinal detachment outcomes database. And in this subset analysis, we looked at eyes that had incisional surgery, so that being scleral buckles, straight vitrectomies, or combination vit buckles for the repair of primary rhegmatogenous detachments. We didn't look at eyes that had complex detachments, tractional detachments, exudative detachments, infection-related, just primary rhegmatogenous retinal detachments, and then looked at the number of eyes that had an OCT postoperatively and whether or not these eyes developed CME at any time point following their retinal detachment surgery.
And what were your findings from the study?
So we analyzed almost 1,500 eyes, all of which had a postoperative OCT following the retinal detachment surgery. The demographics fit your typical retinal, rhegmatogenous retinal detachment cohort study, with the mean age being approximately 60 years old, and nearly 40% of the patients were female. Of our cohort, nearly 60% were phakic, and of these eyes, nearly half of them underwent cataract surgery during the study period. And we did find that all eyes saw a significant improvement in vision following surgery from approximately 2250 to 2050.
Among the nearly 1,500 eyes that fit your criteria, how many developed CME after their surgery?
So among all eyes, we found a nearly 10%, so 9.6 or 140 eyes developed CME following primary rhegmatogenous retinal detachment surgery. When you looked at only the phakic eyes, there were 76 or 9.0% that developed cystoid macular edema. And then in the pseudophakic cohort, again, a similar number, about approximately 10% developed cystoid macular edema.
Now, regardless of phakic status, do you have any numbers on the rate of successful reattachment after a single surgery?
Just looking at all eyes, approximately 83% had a single surgery success rate, meaning that they only required one surgery for retinal detachment repair.
Did you find any risk factors associated with development of CME?
Yeah, so this was the big goal of the study. A lot of statistical analysis was done for this part. We had a great resident, Louis Kai, who helped us do a lot of this heavy stats for this paper. And so we did univariate regression analysis, and then again, multivariate regression analysis for over 70 metrics. So we looked at a lot of different factors. And when you kind of pared everything down in a multivariate regression analysis, the biggest risk factors for all eyes was subsequent cataract surgery or recurrent retinal detachment, meaning they required more than one surgery to fix the retinal detachment. Age was also a pretty big predictor. Older eyes tended to be more prone to develop cystoid macular edema following retinal detachment surgery. But when you looked at eyes that only had one surgery to fix the retinal detachment, the presence of preoperative PVR and subsequent cataract surgery were the biggest risk factors. And interestingly, compared to previous studies, we didn't find other risk factors such as postoperative ERM, high myopia, or time to surgery were not predictors for CME formation following retinal detachment surgery.
Dr. Starr, congrats on a great piece of research, and thanks for speaking with us.
I really appreciate the time to talk with you all today. It was great to kind of share some of the highlights of the study.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of New Retina Radio. We hope you liked our ARVO coverage.
Rate and review the podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and if you haven't subscribed yet, do so. We promise that the content is useful.
We have one more episode of ARVO coverage for this year. Until then, everyone.